Right. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Unit 6. We've been exploring supply and demand. We've explored it in a perfectly competitive market where market forces set the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. We've looked at what the concept of consumer surplus and how that really results in consumers being able to save some money because they were willing to have paid a higher price. And well, we'll just go through some of the details. Okay. So, but tonight what we're going to do is focus on what happens when the government tries to alter the outcome of a perfectly competitive market. Okay. So, well, quickly reviewing Unit 5, there we studied this concept of consumer surplus. And I used the example of buying a CD or a set of CDs. I think I used Rachmaninoff's music because I'm partial to the work he composed. But anyhow, what you saw was in that example, I was willing to pay a certain amount for each one of the CDs, a different amount for each CD because each CD had a different value to me. But when I got to the store, the price was lower than what I was willing to pay for some of the CDs. So therefore, I saved some money because I would have been willing to spend more money. Okay, but I didn't have to because the price was lower. So that amount of savings we called consumer surplus. We went so far as to see what happens. We tried two different prices. So we had a $20 price and then we had a $10 price, and we saw how the consumer surplus increased when the market price was lower. Okay. Moving on further from that, we saw another example where the store selling the CDs was willing to sell all 7 of these CDs for a given price. And the given price in the example here on slide 5 was $75. Well, if you added how much I was willing to pay for those same 7 CDs, I was willing to pay a total of 105, but the price the store was charging was only 75 for the whole ball of wax. So I would have saved $30. I would have thought that was a fantastic deal. We took it a step further and we said, what happens if the store charges $150 for the bundle of all 7 CDs? And we found out that that would be, not a good deal for me because I was only willing to spend 105 for those same 7 CDs. So I would definitely not turn around and spend 150. As a matter of fact, it would have caused me to lose $45 of my savings, and I sure don't want to do that. So that was an example of how consumer surplus works. We went in the opposite direction for the supplier surplus. Here we looked at suppliers being willing to supply a certain amount, and I used the example of these photovoltaic cells, at a given price. And we're looking at how much total would be produced by that industry if the market price set by the equilibrium price set in a perfectly competitive market was at different levels. Okay, and we saw if it was at $35, in this case $35, 7,000 would be provided. Okay, and then we saw, but if the price goes down to $5, there's only going to be 1,000 total provided. So we saw how that was going to change based on the supplier's willingness to supply at each price. And again, we said part of what drives this is how efficient various suppliers are. Some suppliers may be very efficient and have very low operating costs. Other suppliers may not be that efficient and may have very high opportunity or production cost or operations costs, and therefore they can't afford to sell it at low prices. And we saw that some suppliers may have an excess of product that they need to get rid of. They're trying to get rid of the old product or something, and they were willing to sell it at a really low price. So there's a variety of reasons, but we saw that if the price set by the marketplace was at a certain level, here $20, okay, then we would see that some of the suppliers who were willing to sell at a lower price would be making extra profit. So these any of the suppliers who were willing to sell at $15 or $10 or $5, they would be making, actually they'd be selling for 20, so they'd be making that extra money, and we called that extra profit producer's surplus. Okay, and so we saw how that is similar but opposite to what consumer surplus was. Okay, so obviously if you have any questions on what we covered last week in Unit 5, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to deal with it. You know how to contact me. So what we want to do now is see what happens when the government interferes with that perfectly competitive market, and why might they do that? Well, we'll start off with a situation. We're going to say that there's a perfectly competitive market for gizmos. Now, who knows what a gizmo is? I'm making this up, obviously. But we know that because we're dealing with a perfectly competitive market, that this gizmo is a commodity item. Everybody is selling the exact same gizmo. Nobody has a different or better kind of gizmo. They're all the same. Okay? Now, we can take a look at the demand and supply schedule. And so let me see if I can droodle on here while we're talking. That may make it a little bit easier for you to see some of this. So we have a certain amount demanded at each price. So we go down the column, and we have suppliers willing to supply a certain amount at each price. So all we do is look at the prices, okay, and we find that there is one price at which the amount that consumers want to buy is exactly equal to the amount that suppliers want to supply at that price. And we call that our equilibrium price. Nothing new. This is regular, plain vanilla supply and demand in a perfectly competitive market. That's our starting point. Okay, that said, we need to graph this out. So we know what the graph would look like. Here's our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity, and we know our equilibrium point in the center. Okay? Now, we also know, we'll go one step further, that we have a number of consumers based on that demand schedule that we saw who were willing to have paid a higher price than that equilibrium price set by market operations. Okay, and so back to what I was saying earlier. I said that there were a number of consumers who would have been willing to pay a higher price than what the equilibrium price was, and so they all enjoyed some savings, and we called that consumer surplus. That is our yellow triangle. If we go a little further, we find that at that equilibrium price of $20, there were several suppliers who would have been willing to sell at a lower price, but now they're able to sell at the market price of $20. They're very happy. They're making some extra profit, and we call that producer's surplus, or in some cases, supplier's surplus. Same thing. Okay, and so we have that area of the green triangle. Now, if we were to say how much is the total surplus for this particular market, we would merely be able to add the areas of those two triangles, the yellow triangle plus the green triangle. And we'll talk about how to do the computations a little later, because in your Unit 6 assignment, you have the opportunity to make these computations. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time on those later in the seminar. Okay, now, what happens if these suppliers who are supplying this product at $20, okay, but the suppliers really feel that they're not making enough money, that they really need to make more money to make this a viable business, okay, but the market force always settles the price at $20. So the suppliers say, well, maybe we can go to the government And what we'll do is we'll talk to the government and we'll tell them that we will vote them into office or vote for them if they will just make a law that says we have to charge a higher price, and we all have to do it. So if we all do it, then nobody is going to be able to cheat and charge a lower price, charge what the market price is. So let's go to the government and see if we can't get some help. Okay. So with that, they go to the government and they persuade their lawmakers in Washington to pass a law that says from now on, the lowest price you can charge, anybody can sell a gizmo for, is $30. Nobody can sell it for $20. Nobody can sell it for $15. They must sell it for $30. And the whole purpose is to help that group of suppliers make more money. And we call that a price floor. It's a price floor because nobody can go lower than that price. Now, you say, nobody does this. This doesn't happen for real. Well, why don't you Google government agricultural farm price supports? And you might be surprised to find out that this is exactly what some of the price support plans have been for more than 50 years, way more than 50, probably closer to 75 years, for some farm commodities. So this is what we call a price floor. So let's see what happens when we do this. Okay. So, well, the first thing we know that now our price is going to be at $30 because that's what the law says. Well, at $30, we know the suppliers want to supply a lot. They're going to supply 6,000 of these gizmos. But wait a minute, we have a problem. The consumers don't want to buy 6,000 of those. They only want to buy 2,000 at that high price. Holy mackerel, what are we going to do? Well, let's go see what happens. Okay. First off, we now have a new point where the consumers stop buying on their demand curve where the price, where that $30 price is. They stop right there and they buy that amount. Okay, so they're only going to buy 2,000. But what are the suppliers doing at the same time? Well, the suppliers say, wow, this is a great idea, making $30. I'm going to make a lot of these so I can make a lot of profit. They produce 6,000 of them. Okay. So looking at their side, we look at the red supply curve over here. Okay, and we see where the red supply curve crosses the price floor that the suppliers now want to supply 6,000 of these. Okay, they're going to make an awful lot of these things because they want to make some money. Okay, so on the surface, this sounds like something's going to go awry. Well, obviously, we're going to have a bunch of these that don't get sold. Now remember, we're talking about many, many small producers, and they're not talking to each other, but they know what the equilibrium price is, and now they know what the legal price is. Okay, so and we have many, many consumers who they used to know what the equilibrium price was. Now they know what the legal price floor is. So they're still making their own decisions. Okay, so what do we find? We have 2,000 that are sold, but we have 6,000 that are made. Lo and behold, we have 4,000 extra left over at $30 each. Okay, so what ends up happening is we have this whole area down here. There's just too much of the stuff made, and the suppliers are unable to sell it. So obviously that didn't help the suppliers very much. Okay? So let's take a look at what the surplus situation looks like. And we really need to back up a second. Well, let me check one thing. Okay. First off, we know that because of the high price, that the consumer surplus is going to be a lot less because there's only a few consumers who are willing to pay more than $30 for these gizmos. So that our yellow triangle gets very small. Well, that would make sense. Okay. Now, beyond that, we know that the producers, we had producers who were willing to sell for less than 20. We obviously have producers who are willing to sell for less than 30. So we don't exactly get a triangle, but we get this trapezoid area that goes from the zero produced to 2,000 that the consumers buy, and then up to the $30, and that is the producer's surplus. So, and it's interesting to note that part of that producer's surplus actually came from the old consumer surplus. In other words, if we were still at the equilibrium price, okay, remember at the equilibrium price we'd have had this big triangle that was the producer's or the consumer surplus. Well, this piece here, the producers are getting that piece of the surplus now. Okay, and where did it come from? It came from the consumers. Okay. Now, what about this area? Well, this is a whole bunch that was produced but not sold. Okay. So we said that was surplus product. Again, we're using the term surplus two different ways. Now, we have this area that would have originally been sold, okay, and we now call that dead weight loss. The reason it's dead weight loss is that consumers stop buying at this point, at the 2,000. So nothing is sold beyond that. It would have been sold if the market had been able to reach its equilibrium, but it wasn't, and therefore it didn't get sold. Okay, so we call that dead weight loss. Okay, and we actually have another little piece because they made more than that. The producers actually made this extra over here too. And so there's a bunch of extra wasted product that was made that can't be sold. Well, obviously that did not accomplish what the government wanted to have accomplished. Okay? So this just shows the full mix of whose surplus is where and what the dead weight loss is and what the extra wasted is. And we see what the consumers are willing to buy and what the suppliers are willing to make or produce. Okay, now there's got to be a better way to do this, and so the government comes along and says, well, what about if we buy all the excess that you're not able to sell? So here you are, suppliers, you sell to the consumers, and if you're not able to sell it all, we'll buy the excess. And any of you who've listened to the 9 supply and demand videos probably got to see the video, I think it's 7 and 8, 8 and 9, I forget which parts they are, that talks about this exact thing. And I use the example there that was, or I refer to an example of a real life situation back many years ago in dairy products in the Northeast. And the state that my ex-in-laws lived in, the state bought or the government bought all the excess cheese that these dairy producers were making that they couldn't sell. So all this extra was bought by the government. And the government turned around and gave it to the elderly people who were on Social Security. And they were given these giant 5-pound blocks of cheddar cheese. Well, my ex-wife and kids and all, when they were little and we were still married, we'd go up and visit the in-laws, and invariably they would give us 2 or 3 of these 5-pound blocks of cheddar cheese, and we'd bring them home with us. Obviously they were free, and so we didn't go to the store and buy any cheese, okay, because we had plenty of cheese. So here was a system that was defeated because we who could have bought cheese weren't. Okay, we weren't paying money for cheese, we were getting free cheese. So again, you can see how complicated the situation can get. But going a step further, let's take a look at what happens in this situation. We still have the suppliers supplying 6,000 because they have that price floor of $30. So that part's okay. And we still have, let's get rid of the drawing I had. So we have the suppliers, we show them producing, clear over here. Okay. And if we go a little further, what were the consumers doing? Well, the consumers were only buying the 2,000 that they were doing before. Okay, no problem. So we plot them in, and we end up with this big chunk of purple that was not produced, just like we had before. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we've got the part that's not produced because the consumers only bought 2,000, but who's buying it now? Let me ask you, can you think of another situation where the government sets a price floor to help the suppliers and the consumers are stuck paying a higher price and therefore they don't buy as much of the product or service? Anyone got any idea what that might be? It's something all of us are intimately, well, I shouldn't say all of us, many of us are intimately familiar with. Happens every day. No, gasoline you're going to see is something a little different. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Anyone else want to hazard a guess? What situation is there where there's a price set, okay, for what the minimum is that anyone can pay for a particular thing? In this case, a service, not a product, but a service. Okay, nobody's even close, right? Okay, does the words minimum wage mean anything to you? Think about what minimum wage really is. Minimum wage is a legal price floor set by the government to help the suppliers of labor, which are the workers, the unskilled workers, get more money. And basically the government comes along and says that if anyone is going to work, they must be paid a minimum wage. Okay? Now, if that minimum wage is above, well, let me back up and let me talk about that for a second. Okay? If that minimum wage is above equilibrium, okay, then we're going to have a situation very similar to what we see here in slide 29. Okay? What we're going to have is now remember, in this case, the consumers of labor are the businesses who want to buy labor. They're buying unskilled labor. So they hire someone, they're buying their labor. The suppliers, on the other hand, are the workers who want to go to work for in an unskilled environment. Okay, so if the minimum wage, let's assume for a minute that we were talking about $5 here instead of 20, and let's assume up here is 7.25, okay, which is the current minimum wage. Okay, if $5 were the minimum wage that would be the equilibrium wage, then we would find in this example that say 4 million workers would be hired at minimum wage if the minimum wage was $5. But because the government comes along and changes the minimum wage and says now the minimum wage is 7.25, okay, now the businesses only want to hire 2,000. So now we have a bunch of workers who want to work at that 7.25. Actually, we go all the way over to here. Okay, we have a bunch of workers who want to work at that 7.25 an hour, and they can't get jobs because the consumers of labor don't want to pay that extra money. Okay, now here the government's not buying all the extra leftover work, so we have a little problem there, right? But if there were no minimum wage or no price floor on unskilled labor per hour, then the businesses would hire more workers, okay? And we'd actually have more people employed at a lower price. You say, yeah, but there's not enough money to live on at that lower wage. Well, that's true. However, one of the reasons that the cost of living is so high is that we drive up the wages of minimum wage workers, because that sets the baseline for everybody else's pay. So if we were suddenly to raise that minimum wage to $15, the first year the minimum wage workers would do really, really well, but there wouldn't be quite as many of them hired, okay? Because businesses would find less expensive ways to get the service provided, okay? So therefore they wouldn't hire as many people, but the people who got the jobs would really feel good about that. However, remember, if minimum wage goes up, that means everybody else's wages have to go up too. And that means the businesses will have to raise the prices of what they sell in order to make enough money to pay the higher wages. And that means the people who buy the stuff that the businesses make they'll have to pay the higher prices. And that means they're going to have less money to spend. So the ones who were suddenly making $15 an hour are going to find in rather short period of time that it takes as much time and effort of their work hours at this new high price to buy the same stuff that they were buying before at a lower minimum wage. Okay? Why? Because prices went up. So this is a very similar situation to what we were talking about earlier about the whole thing about the government setting some kind of a price floor. Okay, that said, let's go back to slide 51 where we were and see if we can look at something different. Okay, let's see. So this is where we left off. That was with the target price. So what we're going to do, let's get rid of the green line. So what I want to talk about now is what happens if the government would like to help consumers get a lower price. So what the government can do is arbitrarily say, by law, even though the market price for this product is $20, we're going to force everyone to sell the product at a lower price, at $15. Okay. So now what's going to happen? Well, at this new lower price, and again we have to wait for my slide to pop up, so the whole idea is to lower the prices by this amount in order to help the consumers save money. They're paying too much money for whatever the product is. Well, we see at this lower price of $15, now our consumers want to buy 5,000 where they used to buy 4. Okay. What do the suppliers want to do? Well, first off, let's plot that point. So we go to the consumers, and where the consumer demand schedule crosses the price ceiling, we drop a line straight down, and that's where we plotted our 5,000. So at $15, consumers are going to buy 5,000. So we got that on our graph. Okay. What about the suppliers? Well, at this new price of $15, the suppliers only want to supply 3,000. Why? Because the price is too low. They don't want to supply very many at that low price. So we go back and we plot them on the graph. And we see that where the supply schedule graph, the supply curve, crosses the price ceiling, we see the 3,000 that the suppliers are willing to supply. So we got suppliers supplying 3,000, but we got consumers who want to buy 5,000. What do we end up with? Well, we end up with 2,000 shortage. People want to buy and there's none available. And we put that on our graph. So now we have a shortage. And remember, I said at the beginning when we were talking about a perfectly competitive market, a perfectly competitive market at the equilibrium price will be as efficient as it can possibly be, which means there will be no excess product that goes unsold at that price at that equilibrium price, and there'll be no consumers who want to buy product at that equilibrium price who cannot find a willing buyer or seller to sell to them. So there's not going to be any shortage. But here we have an artificial price ceiling installed, which says nobody can charge a higher price than that. And now we have a shortage. Okay. What would be some examples of that? Let's see what my slide pops up as. Oh, my slides are so slow. Okay, this is going to look at what the surpluses are. Now we notice in this case, our producer's surplus is going to be much smaller. Okay? Why? Because we forced the price down. Our consumer surplus is going to be much larger, but part of this extra surplus to the consumers comes from surplus that used to be available or used to be the producers. So in this case, the producers were made worse off in order to make the consumers better off. And remember, part of our discussion about a perfectly competitive market and the market was efficient, we said that nobody could be made better off without making somebody else worse off. So here we see we're making the consumers better off, but we are harming the producers. Earlier, with the price floor, we saw we were helping the producers, but we were harming the consumers. And in this case, we do have a deadweight loss because, again, the suppliers are only supplying 3,000. The consumers want to buy more than that, but originally if there had been no price interference by the government, the consumers would have demanded 4,000 at $20 and the suppliers would have supplied 4,000 at $20. So we actually have 1,000 units that are not sold. Okay? And that is part of our deadweight, or that is our deadweight loss. So now I mentioned that in your assignment for Unit 6 you're going to have to do these kinds of calculations. So I know there's not a whole lot of time, but I'll go through this until I'm done with it, and that way at least it'll be in the archive recording. If you can stick around for it, great. If it takes me longer than the 15 minutes that's left in the seminar. So let's go. Okay. We've been dealing with a triangle, so we're going back to that perfectly competitive market, and we're going to look at how to compute the consumer surplus part by looking at the numbers, okay, and making a computation. Well, we're going to be computing the area of a right triangle. Those of you who had high school geometry probably remembers that the area of a triangle is the height times the base, and that number multiplied together is then divided by 2. So again, relatively simple math. So we start off with we need for the height, we actually are measuring the difference between the high price, which in this case is the $40, okay, and the low price or equilibrium price. So it's high price minus the low price or equilibrium price in this case. So we see our equilibrium price was $20 and our high price was $40. So we plug those into our formula. So we have $40 minus 20. And of course, when we do the math, we end up with $20 left over. That is our height of this triangle. Now we need the base across the bottom. So base is going to be the largest quantity over here that is both that the consumers are consuming, and the smallest quantity that they would consume in this situation, which is a 0. So it's going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be 4,000 minus 0. And when we do the math, obviously if you take nothing away from 4,000, you've got 4,000 left over. So now we have our height and our base of this triangle. Okay. So we're going to make our computations. We're going to multiply height times base. Our height ends up being the $20 we had up here, comes down. Our base is the 4,000 we computed here. It comes over there. We're going to multiply those two numbers together. We get a total of 80,000. And then we have to divide that answer by 2. And we find that our total consumer surplus in this example is $4,000. Okay? And again, you're going to do virtually the same calculation with totally different numbers in your assignment. Now, what about the producer surplus? Well, that's, again, when it's a perfectly competitive market and there's no price floor and no price ceiling. We're going to have something very similar. Okay, the area, the formula is exactly the same. This time our low price is going to be the 0 at the bottom, and the high price is going to be the equilibrium price that the producers are getting. Okay. So simple math, we end up with 20. And when we do the base, our large quantity is going to be the 4,000 that the producers are providing, minus the smaller quantity, which is going to be the 0, because we're starting off in that corner. And lo and behold, we end up with 4,000 minus 0, 4,000 total. We do this virtually the same calculation down here, height times base. And in this example, because the triangles are exactly the same, the total surplus is going to be, oops, back up one. The total surplus for the producers is that 40,000. And if the problem were to ask you what is the total surplus in a perfectly competitive market, or one where there's no price floor or price ceiling, you would add the consumer surplus we got a few minutes ago of 40,000, the yellow triangle, and you'd add it to the green triangle, 40,000 in this case. You'd have a total surplus of 80,000. Pretty straightforward. Now, let's take a look at the calculation when we have a government set price floor. And we're going to use that same $30. Now, and we're going to figure the consumer surplus first. Okay. Always we're using the same formula for a right triangle. We know our high price is that $40. Okay. That's the most any consumer was willing to pay. But this time the low price is the price floor of $30, because that's the lowest price any consumer can buy the product for. So now when we subtract the 30 from 40, we only get 10 for our height of our triangle. Okay. Now, moving on from there, we can look at our base, and we see our large quantity for our base is now the 2,000 that consumers buy. That's all they buy. And of course, our small quantity is still our 0. So if we take 2,000 minus 0, we got 2,000. Nothing complicated there. Now, when we come down to do the actual formula for our the area of our triangle, we're going to take our $10 as our height, and then we're going to take the total of 2,000 that is sold for our base. We're going to multiply those two numbers together. We get 20,000. We have to divide that by 2, because the area of a triangle is height times base divided by 2. And that gives us a total answer of 10,000. Now remember, when we had a perfectly competitive market, we had 40,000. Now we only have $10,000 for the consumer surplus. Now, in this example, we're going to assume that the government is going to buy all the excess product that the producers cannot sell. Okay? So that means the producers are going to produce the 6,000. Their triangle is that whole big green area. Again, we use the exact same formula. Okay. This time, what is our high price? Well, our high price is going to be that $30 that is the price floor that the government set. What's our low price? Well, we had some producers that would have been willing to produce all the way down to zero. So zero is our bottom line. Okay, that gives us a $30 for our height. We come down to the quantity, and remember the producers were willing to produce 6,000 at this high price. So there's our large quantity. Of course, zero is going to be our small quantity. No magic there. So take 6,000, subtract 0 from it, we got 6,000. Okay. Now, using our formula for our triangle, height times base, divided by 2. So now we've got our $30 coming down here. Our 6,000 goes to the base. We make our computation, and lo and behold, the producers are getting 90,000 worth of producer surplus. Okay, again, no magic. By the way, in the hints for the Unit 6 assignment, this is spelled out. There's a sheet that walks you through these exact same or very similar calculations. So you want to be able to take a look at those. I don't know that I use the exact same ones, but you need to take a look at them. They follow the same format. Okay, so we know what our producer surplus and what our consumer surplus is. Well, wait a minute, what about the government? Well, we said the government is going to buy everything that the producers weren't able to sell. So we have how much supplied? Well, there was 6,000 supplied, okay, and the consumers bought 2,000, so that means there's 4,000 left over. What was the price? Well, the government's going to pay the price floor of $30. And in this case, we're not really multiplying out to a triangle. We're not computing a triangle. All we're saying is, how many did the government buy? How much did they pay? Well, they bought 4,000 gizmos, and they paid $30 for each one. Sounds to me like they just paid $120,000 for those gizmos. Now, what the government does to get rid of them, we don't know. Now, if we're going to figure total surplus in this case, okay, well, obviously we would add the consumer surplus we got with a price floor. What was that? We go back a couple slides, and I want to say that was 10,000. And then we want to add the amount that the producers surplus was, and I think that was maybe 90,000. So we have a total of 100,000 of surplus there. But how much does the government have to collect in taxes to pay this off? Well, the government has to collect 120,000 in taxes. So the amount of taxes the government has to collect to buy the excess product has to be subtracted from the total surplus, the addition of consumer surplus plus producer surplus, in order to make this a fair computation of the total surplus for the system, for the entire economy. So what we would find is that the government's going to spend 120, so we're going to subtract 120 from the 100,000, and we're actually going to have a minus 20,000 total surplus in this case. So, but the whole thing was this something designed to help the producers? And did the government do the right thing? Now, we were talking earlier about the fact that this revolved around an example of this was farm supports. That's where the government actually would purchase the extra wheat or extra dairy products or extra whatever, and then distribute it somehow. As a matter of fact, at one time we had the U.S. Aid Department, it's USAID Department, and their mission was to take the excess food that was available here in the United States and donate it to countries around the world so poor people would have more to eat. Well, on the surface, that sounds like a really great thing. But imagine that you're a farmer trying to farm in a country that is one of the poorer countries, but you're lucky enough to have some land or access to some land. You have the ability to grow some food, and you're going to sell that food. Okay, and that's how you're going to make your living. And all of a sudden, one of these big United States cargo ships pulls up at the local dock and they start handing out all this free food. Who's going to come to you in that country and buy food from you when they can go down to the dock and get the free food from the United States? So what ended up happening was the local producers in those countries went out of business and they needed help. Okay? They needed charity now. So that is an example of how unintended consequences can occur from what on the surface seems like a really, really good idea. One, we're going to help our farmers who they're not making enough money because there are many, many small farms, and we're going to help all the poor people in this country, okay, in this other country. So again, things that are planned sometimes by the government have unintended consequences. Now, there's an additional unintended consequence when it comes to farm supports. I don't know how many of you have been involved with farming, but many of you are probably familiar with the fact that now, many years ago, we used to have many small farms, each farmer farming a plot of land, maybe 40, maybe 60, maybe 160 acres. Now we have mega corporations farming tens of thousands of acres at a time. Okay, these are big corporations. These are not small farmers, not a husband and wife and their kids working the farm. This is a major corporation, and yet we still have farm support programs in place. So we are still sending welfare checks through the agriculture department to these mega corporations growing food all over the country. An interesting aside. It is worthy of you doing some research if it's something that interests you. Now, one other thing I'd like to bring up, and I know we only have a minute or two, in one of your discussion thread questions, I think this week, you're going to be talking about, as a matter of fact, let's see if I have it here. You definitely want to watch the videos part 6, 7, and 9. 6 and 7 are going to go through this same thing, only with different numbers. So you get to see how that theory works out. Okay? But the discussion that I wanted to talk about is going to be, should the government put a price ceiling on prescription drugs? Okay? Prescription drugs, that's an important thing. Okay? Well, first off, does the market for prescription drugs meet the requirements of a perfectly competitive market? Well, that's one question. The second question is, when we look at these, and that's why I give you the percentages of global sales in the table at the right. Anyhow, it just gives you some concept of, which drugs, sell how much in the world market. But what happens? What's the plus and what's the minus of helping people have lower prices for prescription drugs? Okay, your assignment is going to have you calculating the consumer surplus, the producer surplus. You're going to do it for both a perfectly competitive market and for a market with a price floor. And then you're going to have to compute the total impact or total surplus after we include the effort that the government has to collect taxes to pay. So with that, you know how to contact me. And like I said, remember that we'll see you